She's just a useless daughter." My mother's voice cut through the courtroom so sharply that every conversation in the room died instantly. The kind of silence that falls when strangers suddenly feel uncomfortable watching a family tear itself apart. I didn't react. I stood at the defense table in the old county courthouse in Mason County, Ohio, hands folded in front of me, eyes forward, saying nothing. Behind me, someone whispered, "Lord have mercy." My father sat beside my mother with his arms crossed, jaw tight like he was grinding down a stone. The judge slowly looked up from the documents in front of him. For a moment, he studied me. Then he leaned back in his chair and turned his attention to my parents' attorney. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Counselor," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Do you really not know who she is?" The attorney froze. My mother's face went pale. My father blinked like the air had just been knocked out of him, and the entire courtroom suddenly felt different. Because that question was the moment everything started to change. But that moment didn't begin in this courtroom. It started months earlier, the day I drove back into a town I had sworn I would never return to. Mason County, Ohio. A small town that remembers everything about you, especially the things you were trying to leave behind. The truth is, that moment in the courtroom didn't begin with my mother's words. It started months earlier, the day I drove back into Mason County. I hadn't been there in almost 8 years. 8 years is a long time in a small Ohio town. Long enough for kids to grow up, for storefronts to change hands, and for people to decide who you are without ever hearing your side of the story. But Mason County looked almost exactly the same. The brick courthouse still sat on the corner of Main and Jefferson like it had been planted there 100 years ago. Across the street, Sullivan's Diner still had that flickering red neon sign buzzing softly in the window. The same pickup trucks were parked along the curb, most of them older than some of the people driving them. Small towns don't forget things, especially not people. I pulled my truck into a parking spot outside the diner and turned off the engine. For a minute, I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel. The early October air had that familiar smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke drifting through town. Somewhere down the street, a screen door slammed, and a dog barked twice before going quiet again. It felt strange being back. Not scary, just heavy. The last time I had driven out of Mason County, I did it before sunrise. I had packed one bag, tossed it into the back of my truck, and left without telling anyone where I was going. No goodbye, no explanation, just miles of highway and the feeling that I needed to start over somewhere else. That was the last time I saw my parents. Until now. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the diner. The bell above the door rang the same way it always had. Every head inside turned. That's another thing about small towns. When someone walks in who hasn't been around for years, people notice. Diane was standing behind the counter pouring coffee into a thick white mug. She froze for half a second when she saw me. Then her eyes widened. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. "Emma Parker." I gave her a small smile. "Morning, Diane." She set the coffee pot down and looked me over like she was flipping through old memories, trying to match them to the person standing in front of her. "Didn't think we'd see you around here again," she said. "Neither did I answered. I slid onto one of the stools at the counter. Without asking, she grabbed a mug and poured me a cup of black coffee. Some things never change. I wrapped my hands around the mug and took a sip. It tasted exactly the same as it had when I was 18. Across the diner, Mr. Sullivan lowered his newspaper just enough to look over the top of it. He must have been pushing 80 by now, but his memory still worked just fine. "Thought that was you," he muttered. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan," I said. He nodded once. Nobody asked too many questions at first. That's another small-town rule. People like to watch before they start talking, but I could already feel it happening. The quiet whispers, the curious looks, the questions forming behind polite smiles. Why was Emma Parker back? And the truth was, I hadn't come back for the town. I came back because 3 weeks earlier, my phone rang while I was sitting in my apartment in Columbus, and the voice on the other end said something I hadn't expected to hear again. "Emma," he said gently, "this is Pastor Mitchell." And that's when I learned my grandmother had died. Pastor Mitchell's voice stayed with me long after that phone call ended. Grandma Margaret had passed away sometime during the night. "Peacefully," he said, "the kind of passing people hope for when they reach the end of a long life." But that wasn't the part that made the room feel smaller. It was what he told me next. "She left a will," he said gently. and there's something in it you should probably hear directly." I leaned back in the chair in my Columbus apartment, staring at the kitchen wall. "What is it, Pastor?" There was a small pause. "The farmhouse," he said. "And the 2 acres behind it. Your grandmother left it to you." For a moment, I didn't say anything. That little farmhouse outside Mason County had been the only place in my childhood that ever felt calm. The creaky porch swing, the apple tree in the yard, the smell of cinnamon bread drifting out of Grandma's kitchen on Sunday mornings. But I also knew something else. The second my parents heard about that will, there would be trouble. And trouble arrived faster than I expected. 2 days after I got back to town, I was sitting on the porch of Grandma's house watching the wind move across the fields when I heard gravel crunching in the driveway. I didn't even have to look. I recognized the sound of my father's old Buick. The car rolled to a stop beside the barn, and the engine shut off with that familiar rattle it had always had. For a second, no one got out. Then the driver's door opened. My father stepped out first. He looked older than I remembered. His shoulders were a little heavier, his hair more gray than brown. But the way he stood, arms stiff at his sides, was exactly the same. My mother climbed out of the passenger side a moment later. Neither of them waved. They walked toward the porch slowly, like they were approaching a stranger's house instead of their daughter's. I stayed in the chair. My father stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked around the yard. "So," he said finally, "you came back for the money." I kept my voice steady. "It's not about money." My mother crossed her arms. "That's funny," she said bitterly, "because you disappear for years and suddenly show up the minute there's property involved." The wind moved through the apple tree behind the house, shaking loose a few leaves that drifted down into the yard. I stood up from the porch. "Grandma asked for me," I said quietly. My father gave a short laugh that didn't carry any humor. "That's interesting," he said, "because we were the ones taking care of her." The conversation didn't last long. Arguments like that never do. People don't come looking for understanding. They come looking for confirmation. My mother shook her head slowly. "You always were selfish," she said. "And stubborn." I didn't answer. I had learned a long time ago that some arguments only get louder the more you participate. My father finally stepped closer to the porch. "If you had any decency left in you," he said, "you'd sign that house over to us." I looked past him toward the fields stretching out behind the barn. Grandma had planted most of those fence posts herself 50 years earlier. "I'm not signing anything," I said. My father's jaw tightened. "Then we'll handle it another way." 3 days later, a sheriff's deputy knocked on the farmhouse door. He handed me a thick envelope and asked me to sign for it. Inside were the court papers. My parents were officially contesting the will. They were asking a judge to overturn Grandma Margaret's final decision. In other words, they were taking their own daughter to court over a house and 2 acres of Ohio farmland. I stood in the kitchen for a long time holding those papers, not angry, not surprised, just tired. Because in a small town like Mason County, family fights don't stay inside the family for long. Soon enough, the whole town would know. And before the court date even arrived, most of them had already decided who the villain was. By the time the court date arrived, most of Mason County had already picked a side. That's the thing about small towns. People don't wait for facts. They wait for stories, and once they have one, they hold on to it. According to the version moving through town, I was the daughter who ran off, ignored her family for years, and then came back the minute there was land involved. It was a simple story. Simple stories spread fast. The morning of the hearing was colder than the days before. October wind rattled the flag above the courthouse as I climbed the brick steps with a folder tucked under my arm. Inside, the building smelled exactly the way county courthouses always do: old paper, floor polish, and the faint scent of coffee someone had carried down the hallway. The courtroom doors were already open, and the seats behind the railing were fuller than I expected. A few retirees from town sat in the back row pretending they had business in court that morning. Mr. Sullivan from the diner was there too, sitting quietly with his cap resting on his knee. People in small towns don't miss a good family dispute. My parents were already seated at the front table beside their attorney, Harold Price. He looked exactly like the kind of lawyer who spent most of his career in county courtrooms: pressed suit, silver hair, and the relaxed confidence of someone who expected the day to go his way. My mother sat stiff beside him, purse clutched in her lap. My father stared straight ahead like the wooden wall in front of him had personally offended him. Neither of them looked at me when I walked in. I took the seat at the opposite table. Alone. Price glanced over and raised an eyebrow. "You're representing yourself?" he asked quietly. "Yes." He gave a polite chuckle, the kind people use when they're trying not to sound dismissive. "Well," he said, adjusting the cuff of his jacket, "that's brave." Maybe he thought it was foolish. Maybe most of the room did. But the truth was simple. I hadn't come here to perform. I came here because my grandmother wrote something down, signed her name, and meant it. And sometimes the truth doesn't need a lawyer to decorate it. The bailiff called the room to order a few minutes later. "All rise." Everyone stood as Judge Robert Whitman entered the room. He was a tall man in his late 60s with silver hair and tired eyes, the kind of eyes that come from watching people bring their worst arguments into a courtroom for 30 years. He sat down, adjusted the papers in front of him, and nodded once. "All right," he said calmly. "Let's begin." Price stood first. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked to the center of the room like he had done it 1,000 times before. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this is a painful matter for my clients." He gestured toward my parents. They cared for Mrs. Margaret Parker in her later years. The property in question has long been understood to remain within the immediate family. His voice carried across the room easily. "Meanwhile," he continued, nodding in my direction, "the defendant has been absent from this community for years." I stayed seated, hands folded, listening. She returned only after Mrs. Parker passed, he said, when there was something to gain. A few people in the back shifted in their seats. Judge Whitman wrote something down slowly with his pen. Then he looked up. "Miss Parker," he said, turning toward me, "you may respond." Every head in the room turned my direction again. I stood. My chair slid softly against the wooden floor. "I'm representing myself," I said calmly. "And the will my grandmother wrote is clear." I opened the folder in front of me and removed the documents I had brought. Letters, printed emails, money order receipts. Nothing dramatic. Just quiet proof. I walked them to the clerk and returned to my seat. No speeches. No raised voice. Just paper. And the truth. Judge Whitman began reading through the pages carefully. The room grew so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming above us. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the judge paused on one document longer than the others. His eyes narrowed slightly. He looked up at me, then at the papers again, and slowly, he set his pen down. "Counselor," he said, turning toward Price. "Before you continue," he lifted the document slightly. "Do you really not know who she is?" The room didn't move after the judge asked that question. For a moment, it felt like the entire courthouse had stopped breathing. Harold Price stood there with one hand resting on the edge of the table. The confidence he walked in with suddenly a little less steady. "My understanding," he said carefully, "is that she's the defendant in this case, Your Honor." Judge Whitman didn't smile. "No," he said quietly. "That's not what I asked." A few people shifted in their seats behind me. Someone whispered something I couldn't quite hear, but the judge lifted one sheet from the stack of documents the clerk had handed him and tapped it lightly with the end of his pen. "Before presenting arguments about a person's character," he said, looking directly at Price, "it's usually wise to understand who that person is." Price stepped closer to the bench and leaned forward slightly to read the page. From where I stood, I already knew which document it was. The VA verification letter. The one confirming my service record. At first his expression didn't change. Then his eyebrows moved just a little. Not much, but enough. He straightened slowly. "I was not aware of this," he said. "That's clear," Judge Whitman replied. My mother leaned forward sharply. "Your Honor," she said, her voice tightening. "What does that have to do with anything?" The judge didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the courtroom. Then he said something simple. "Miss Parker served 8 years in the United States Marine Corps." The words settled into the room like the echo of a bell. In a place like Mason County, those words carry weight. You could feel it ripple through the courtroom. A man in the back row sat up straighter. Another older gentleman slowly removed his hat. My father blinked. My mother stared at me like she was trying to recognize someone she had never actually met. "What?" she said quietly. Judge Whitman continued in the same calm voice. "According to the documentation provided, Miss Parker completed multiple overseas deployments and received several commendations during her service." He set the paper back down. "I normally avoid personal commentary in probate disputes," he added. "But when someone's character is being publicly questioned, context matters." No one spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. My father finally leaned forward in his chair. "You were in the Marines?" he asked. His voice sounded different now. Not angry, just confused. I nodded once. "Yes." My mother shook her head slowly. "That can't be right," she said. "You never told us." I looked at her for a moment. Then I answered the only way I could. "You never asked." Those 3 words landed harder than any speech I could have given. My mother sat back in her chair. My father rubbed his jaw like he was trying to process something that didn't fit the story he had been telling himself for years. Price cleared his throat, trying to pull the conversation back into legal territory. "Your Honor," he said, "while military service is certainly admirable, I fail to see how it affects the matter of the estate." Judge Whitman nodded slightly. "You're correct," he said. "Service alone does not determine inheritance." He paused. "But it does challenge the narrative presented earlier." His eyes shifted briefly toward my mother. "What was the phrase used?" He glanced at his notes. "A useless daughter." My mother's face flushed red. "I didn't mean—" The judge lifted his hand gently. "This court is not here to referee family insults," he said. He looked back down at the will in front of him. "But it is here to examine—" Then he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "And the facts," he said quietly, "tell a very different story." For a few seconds after the judge said that, nobody spoke. The room felt different now. Before, people had been watching a family argument. Now they were listening to something else entirely. Judge Whitman picked up the will again and turned a few pages slowly, the paper making a soft rustling sound in the quiet courtroom. "Mr. Price," he said calmly, "you may continue." Price cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. The confidence he walked in with hadn't completely disappeared, but it was thinner now. "Your Honor," he began carefully, "while new information has come to light regarding Miss Parker's background, the legal question before the court remains unchanged." He gestured toward the will. "The matter is whether the transfer of property may have been influenced unfairly." Judge Whitman nodded slightly. "And your evidence for that claim?" he asked. Price hesitated for half a second. "My clients believe—" The judge lifted a hand. "Belief," he said quietly, "is not evidence." A faint murmur moved through the room. Price shifted his weight. "In that case," he continued, choosing his words more cautiously, "we ask the court to consider the broader circumstances of the family relationship." Judge Whitman turned his attention toward me again. "Miss Parker," he said, "would you like to address the court before I review the final documents?" I stood. The wooden chair behind me slid softly across the floor. For the first time that morning, I glanced at my parents. They looked smaller than they had earlier. Not physically smaller, just less certain. "My grandmother and I spoke often," I said calmly. "Not every week, but when we could." My mother scoffed under her breath. "That's not true." I didn't react. "I sent her letters," I continued, "and sometimes money when she needed help with groceries or repairs." Judge Whitman flipped through the documents again. "I see several money orders here," he said. My father frowned. "She never told us about that." I met his eyes briefly. "She asked me not to." My mother leaned forward. "Why would she do that?" "Because she didn't want you to think I was trying to prove something," I answered. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. "And why did she leave the house to you?" he asked. That question hung in the air for a moment. The answer wasn't complicated. "Because she believed I would take care of it," I said. Price crossed his arms. "Your Honor, with respect, emotional statements don't determine estate law." "That's correct," Judge Whitman replied. He looked down at the will again and tapped the page lightly with his pen. "Which is why we look at written intent." He paused, long enough that everyone in the room leaned forward just a little. "The will is clear," he said. Margaret Parker left the farmhouse and the 2 acres of land to her granddaughter, Emma Parker. My mother stood abruptly. "That's not fair," she said. The bailiff took a step forward. "Ma'am." Judge Whitman raised a hand gently. "Mrs. Parker," he said calmly, "I understand this is difficult. But it's wrong," she insisted. "We were the ones there every day." The judge nodded slowly. "That may be true," he said. "But presence alone does not override a written will." My father stood beside her. "So that's it?" he said. "She just takes it?" Judge Whitman looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. "This case," he said quietly, "isn't really about the house, is it?" No one answered. He folded his hands together. "It's about years of resentment that finally reached a courtroom." The room stayed silent. Then he looked down once more at the documents before him. "The court will uphold the will as written," he said. He lifted the gavel, and with one small tap against the wood, the decision was made. "The property belongs to Miss Parker." That should have felt like victory, but standing there in that quiet courtroom, it didn't feel like winning. It felt like the truth had finally caught up with a story that had been wrong for a very long time. The gavel echoed once across the courtroom. Then everything started to loosen. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. People whispered to one another as they stood. A few folks in the back glanced at me with quiet nods before heading toward the hallway. In a small town, a courtroom empties the same way a church does, slowly and politely. But I stayed where I was. My hands rested on the folder in front of me, the same folder that had carried a few letters, some receipts, and a truth nobody in that room had expected. Across the aisle, my parents hadn't moved. My mother sat staring down at the table like she'd misplaced something important and didn't know where to start looking. My father's hands were clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Their attorney leaned down and spoke quietly to them for a moment. Then he straightened, gave my father a small, awkward pat on the shoulder, and left the room. And just like that, it was the three of us. No lawyers, no judge, just a family that hadn't known how to talk to each other for years. I gathered my papers slowly and stood. For a moment, the old instinct came back, the same one that had carried me out of Mason County years earlier. Leave before things get worse. Walk away before someone says something that can't be taken back. But this time I didn't move toward the door. My father looked up first. "You were really in the Marines?" he asked. His voice sounded rough, like the question had been sitting in his throat for a long time. "Yes." He studied my face like he was trying to line up two versions of the same person. The daughter, he remembered. And the one standing in front of him now. 8 years, he said. "That's right." My mother finally lifted her head. "You never told us," she said quietly. But the anger that had filled her voice earlier was gone. Now it sounded smaller, almost uncertain. I held her gaze for a moment. "You never asked." The words weren't meant to hurt. They were simply the truth. My father rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he'd had since I was a kid whenever he didn't know what to say. "Well," he muttered, "I guess we didn't." No one spoke for a few seconds. Then my mother asked something I hadn't expected. "Were you overseas?" I nodded. "A few times." Her eyes widened just a little. "And we didn't even know." The realization seemed to settle over both of them at the same time. Years had passed. Deployments, danger, long nights, and long distances, and they had missed all of it. Not because I had hidden it, but because somewhere along the way we had stopped asking questions about each other's lives. My father stood slowly. He looked around the empty courtroom like he was seeing it differently now. "This whole thing was a mistake," he said quietly. My mother turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the bench where the judge had been sitting. "Dragging our daughter into court over a house." The word daughter sounded strange coming from him, like it had been sitting unused for too long. My mother's shoulders sank. "I thought she didn't care about us anymore," she said softly. I stepped closer to the table. "I did care," I said. "But every time we talked before I left, it turned into an argument." My father nodded slowly. "That's true." He looked at me again. "You always wanted to do things your own way." "Yes," I said. "And that scared you." He didn't deny it. For a long moment, the three of us stood there in the quiet courtroom. All the anger that had brought us into that building suddenly felt smaller than the years we had lost. My mother finally asked the question that mattered. "What are you going to do with the house?" I thought about the farmhouse, the apple tree in the yard, the creaky porch steps my grandmother used to sit on every evening. "I'm going to fix it up," I said. My father nodded once. "It needs it." And that was the first honest thing we had all agreed on that day. The farmhouse had been standing on that patch of Ohio land for nearly 50 years. Time had a way of leaving its fingerprints on every board and nail. The roof sagged slightly near the chimney. The porch railing leaned an inch too far outward, and the apple tree in the yard had grown wild without anyone trimming its branches for years. We all knew the house needed work. What none of us said out loud was that the family probably did too. My mother picked up her purse slowly. "I suppose," she said hesitantly, "we should come by sometime." The words sounded careful, like she wasn't sure if she had the right to say them. "You're welcome to," I replied. Not a grand invitation, just a simple one, the kind that leaves room for something to grow. We walked out of the courthouse together. Outside, the October sun had warmed the brick steps, and a few people across the street pretended not to stare as we came out. Small towns never stop watching. But something about the way people looked at us had changed. Not dramatically, just enough. My father paused beside his old Buick and looked at me. "Well," he said, clearing his throat. "Guess we'll see you around." I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "Guess you will." They drove away a minute later, and I stood there on the courthouse steps watching the car disappear down Main Street. Behind me was the courtroom. Ahead of me was the farmhouse. And somewhere between those two places was a family trying to figure out how to speak again. The first Sunday after the hearing was colder than the week before. Ohio weather does that in October. One day the trees glow orange and gold, and the next morning the wind carries that sharp edge that reminds you winter isn't far off. I was halfway up a ladder replacing loose shingles when I heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. I didn't need to turn around. My father's Buick had a muffler rattle you could hear from half a mile away. I climbed down from the ladder and wiped my hands on a rag. The car parked near the barn. For a moment, neither door opened. Then my mother stepped out first. She was holding a covered casserole dish. Some habits don't disappear just because a family argues. Sunday lunch had always meant someone bringing food. My father climbed out a second later and walked toward the house, his eyes moving up to the roof. "You were right," he said. "Those shingles are about 10 years past their prime." I smiled slightly. "That's why I started replacing them." He stepped closer to the ladder and looked at the stack of shingles beside the porch. "You can't finish that alone," he said. "I know." He nodded once. "Good." Then he walked back to the car and pulled a toolbox from the trunk. No speech. No apology. Just a man opening a toolbox. My mother headed up the porch steps. "I'll put this in the kitchen," she said quietly. The screen door creaked the same way it always had. Inside the house, the smell of coffee and cinnamon drifted out a few minutes later. My father and I worked side by side on the roof most of the morning, passing shingles, hammering nails, checking the boards underneath. At first we didn't talk much, but working together has a way of loosening words. 8 years, he said eventually, handing me another shingle. "That's a long time." "Yes," I said. "It is." He nodded slowly. "You must have seen a lot." I thought about deserts, ocean, air, long nights on base far from home. "Some things," I said. He didn't push for details. Maybe he understood that some stories take time. Around noon, my mother opened the screen door and called out, "Lunch is ready." We climbed down the ladder and washed our hands at the outdoor spigot like we used to when I was a kid. The three of us sat around my grandmother's kitchen table. For the first time in years, it felt like the beginning of something instead of the end. We sat around my grandmother's kitchen table for a long time that afternoon. The same table she used to drink tea at every evening while the sun dipped behind the fields. The wood was worn smooth in places where hands had rested for decades. You could almost feel the history in it. For a while, none of us talked much. My mother poured coffee. My father stared out the window toward the apple tree swaying in the cool October wind. The house creaked softly the way old farmhouses always do when the temperature starts dropping. Finally, my mother set her fork down. "Emma," she said quietly. I looked up. Her eyes were red, like she had been holding something in for a long time. "I shouldn't have called you useless," she said. The words came slowly, like they had to push past years of pride to get out. My father nodded beside her. "That wasn't right," he added. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle. "You were angry," I said. "Yes," my mother admitted. "But that doesn't excuse it." My father leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hands together. "We didn't understand you," he said. "And instead of asking questions, we made assumptions." I nodded slowly. "That happens in a lot of families." My mother looked down at the table. "I was afraid," she said softly. "Afraid of what?" I asked. "That you left because I failed you." The room went quiet again. Sometimes the truth hiding under anger is simpler than the anger itself. "I didn't leave because you failed," I said. "I left because I needed to figure out who I was." My father looked out toward the fields again and nodded once. "That takes courage," he said. Coming from him, those words meant more than I expected. Later that afternoon, we sat together on the porch under the old apple tree. The wind carried the smell of dry leaves across the yard, and the sky stretched wide over the Ohio farmland. For the first time in years, the silence between us didn't feel like distance. It felt like space. The kind of space where something broken can slowly begin to mend. This story reminds us that the truth about a person is often deeper than the labels others place on them. Families sometimes judge, assume, or misunderstand because they stop asking questions and stop listening. But time, honesty, and humility can reopen doors that once seemed closed forever. Real strength is not always loud. It can appear in quiet perseverance, dignity under criticism, and the courage to keep showing respect even when hurt. In life, especially as we grow older, we learn that relationships matter more than winning arguments. Sometimes, healing begins with something simple: listening again, asking again, and choosing understanding over pride.